So I'm here today with Daniel Foor, who is a licensed psychotherapist and doctor of psychology, and has also been leading ancestral and family healing intensives throughout the United States since 2005. He's also an initiate in the Ifa Orisha tradition of Yoruba-speaking West Africa, and has trained with teachers of Mahayana Buddhism, Islamic Sufism, and many different indigenous paths as well, including the older ways of his European ancestors. And he lives right now in Asheville, North Carolina. And so we're going to be talking today about healing racism with the backing of the ancestors. And I'm Langston Kahn. I'm a Black queer shamanic practitioner. My practice is called Occupy Your Heart. And I am also a student of Daniel's. I've been working with him in his ancestral lineage repair practitioner training over the past year. And so today we would love to just explore the ways that our beautifully diverse ancestors, including those who may have acted harmfully during their life, can be really potent allies for transforming racism that we're experiencing or challenged by, or even working to root out in ourselves. And this interview will just explore some of those intersections of how our ritual healing work, our activism, and our cultural healing can all inform each other.
Great. Glad to be here, Langston. Thanks for the intro.
Yeah, really glad to have you.
Good.
So I guess the first question I wanted to start out with is if you could just share a little bit about your own ancestry and what brought you to ancestral healing work.
Sure. My blood ancestors are of English, German, Irish descent, early settler colonizers to North America by way of Pennsylvania and Ohio. And I wasn't raised with any religious anything from my family, really, which was fine. I mean, they're good and loving people, and I'm in a good way with them. And they're not unusually culturally aware, but kind also. And I sought out, even as a teenager, ritual, paganism, shamanism, and had the instinct from early on, who knows why. I think maybe what we come to this earth with, it was just part of my composition, to be drawn to ritual, religion, ceremony, things like that. And so over the last 25 years, I've really dove in with training with different teachers and systems, some more earth honoring and some indigenous, some less so, but definitely earth honoring, and some more like Buddhism or Islam. But where I've settled is really with the earth honoring or animist kinds of traditions. And in the last cycle of 10, 15 years, immersion in Yoruba tradition, so from Southwest Nigeria, Ifa, Orisha systems. And within all that, I have developed in the last 15 years an approach to working with blood lineage ancestors and healing with our ancestors that, of course, comes out of my own experience of cultural recovery as a sort of culturally dislocated, amnesiac, white American, and trying to find orientation within that in a spiritual way. And my first teachers in paganism, shamanism in Ohio, also largely of European ancestry, did me a really precious favor of encouraging me to get to know my own ancestors. And that's been very healing for me, and it has woven together with my training in psychology and psychotherapy. And so in the last 15 years, I've been guiding people in that kind of ancestral healing and recovery. And then in just the last few years, training others in how to guide that as well. So it's been healing for me. And in the last maybe 5 years, some of the cultural healing implications of that work that I was kind of in a way already became more articulated, or more, you're sitting in a pattern and suddenly becomes conscious, like, oh, this is why I've been doing this. Oh, geez. And initially, to make some of those connections, I wanted to throw up a little bit, because it was like, oh no, this is going to mean looking at stuff I've been avoiding looking at, or this is vulnerable, this is uncomfortable. But once you move through that, then you're just in the mix with everybody trying to work it out.
Could you talk a little bit about how you define cultural healing?
Yeah. The shorthand way I think of that is a half. Of course, there are more, but I think of a half dozen kinds of uh, human toxins or confusions that are recurrent enough across different systems and cultures that they're worth calling out as patterns. And I think it's important to note that these are all interrelated, intersexual, intersectional coexisting at to different degrees, but they're also distinct. So in no particular order, the half dozen that I work from are earth disconnection, like a lack of an animist framework or an earth honoring framework, um, capitalism, exploitative economic systems, greed, unequal distribution of wealth. So essentially hoarding or lack of sharing, income inequality, all that, poverty. Another is sexism, which for me in a broader sense includes not just patriarchy, misogyny, violence toward women, but also homophobia, transphobia, sex negativity, and like repressive, restrictive ways of holding gender. And colonialism, the occupation of others' land and the judgment of their cultures. And that lens is important for understanding the genocidal attitudes of Europeans toward people in the Americas, for example, and parts of a lot of Africa. And religious extremism or dogmatism that shows up a lot around religion, but not only religion. And then, of course, racism, which is essentially ancestral inflation or favoritism that gets played out in, potentially genocidal, extreme ways, subtle ways, all kinds of different ways. So those are the half dozen kinds of troubles that I work from. And so when I talk about cultural healing, it's intended to be, sometimes I'll use the language of social and earth justice, which is, it's not inaccurate, but the word justice only, to me, there's something a little bit incomplete about that. There's a spirit of love and kindness that's also an important element. And so I find that also in my social position as like a privileged American white guy, if I can be not always threatening to the often other white people I'm trying to reach, cultural healing can be a little more welcoming than social justice as a language. So I'm trying to bring a lot of people to the table around things. So yeah, for me, cultural healing includes earth healing because they're not really environmental problems. They're just bad human behavior problems. So I'm, out of a love for the earth, I'm on assignment in the human realms. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so in the context of cultural healing, I know you've always certainly put, or not always, but in the time that I've known you, put healing around racism as a priority in that context. And I was curious just what your process was like for coming to that being a priority for you. And if that was like sort of a more recent concern or something you always were focused on.
Yeah, it's, to be honest, it's more recent. Like of the different kinds of troubles I was mentioning, I've always had an aversion to dogmatism, love for the earth. I came out as gay, then bi, just even in high school. And so I've had a maybe heightened awareness around LGBTQ, type concerns. But in terms of race, as a white American who grew up in a almost entirely white school and environment, I wasn't forced to become more culturally aware and educated, and not just educated, but like heart level educated about the real impact of racism. So it's more of an abstract intellectual. Yeah, of course racism is bad, duh. But that's different than actually knowing, like having investment. And so part of it has been my draw to West African practice and being a student in communities of color in Oakland and then in the last 4 pilgrimages to Nigeria, and also learning how race is held differently in West Africa than in the Americas. And so travel helped me to become a bit more aware. Living in Egypt, seeing racism in Ecuador, Mexico, and different places where I've lived, but it didn't really hit home until I had more people of African ancestry in my immediate personal sphere who I deeply care about. I guess if I have to say, like, what really shifted it from kind of more abstract to like, this, I'm all the way in, this matters. This is like, this heart level matters. I like, I'm going to get, like, I'll get pissed about it. I'm in, like, I'm invested. It's not just a passive kind of liberal white thumbs down to racism. And so now, that's maybe in the last 5 or 6 years, I guess, that I've been like, and also I was scared to step in. And I had the confusion that, not in a conscious way, but the confusion that it's, it sounds terrible to even say it out loud, but something to the effect of like racism is a concern for people of color, or like queer issues is a concern for queer people, or like I hadn't emotionally pieced it together that racism hurts white people too, also. And so it just, something shifted in the last, probably 5, 6 years around that. And I'm still in process around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in the context of your ancestral healing work that you guide, have you found that can be supportive for healing toxicity around racism, and what does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of ways that can be supportive, I think. The first thing to say is that I don't want to feed the idea that racism is only an inner work kind of thing, or that it's only interpersonal. Mm-hmm. I've actually come to see racism as largely systemic, in the sense that it's the structures, the institutions, et cetera, that uphold and replicate racism. And so I'm thinking I read an influential book, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibrahim Kendi recently. And he shares in the book how he was even surprised that he'd internalized the view that seeing the world in a racist way tends to lead to racist institutions. And he was saying from his research, he realized that in fact, the creation of racist institutions tends to generate the racist views, that the flow of causality seemed to really, the more convincing historical story is that we need to make sure we stay focused on systemic change of the actual institutions. So having said that, there's of course a ton of interpersonal and inner work to be done around transforming racist views and ideas as well. So both. I just don't I don't want whatever I would say to draw attention away from the critical importance of systemic change and change of the actual laws and actual physical conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of trouble as contemporary Western people because we're not as exposed to cosmologies of complementary dualism. So it always kind of has to be one or the other. Whereas in my experience, there's sort of no transformation of a system without transformation of the individual as well, and vice versa. You can't just focus on your individual process and ignore what's going on in the world around you.
For sure. And my specific role isn't directly leveraging systems per se. It's work with the spirits, work with individual psyches, with community, with worldview, and all that. So having said that, a couple of the ways that I've seen ancestral recovery work be useful across the board and differently useful maybe for people of color or people of European ancestry is, one is that we can connect with older ancestors who are really vibrant, healed, and well. And so if one sense of self or an aspect of oneself, if a person's multiracial, is so defined by suffering and by a very legitimate perception of having been historically oppressed, it's possible to connect to even older ancestors who lived before those times. Like, for example, someone of African ancestry in the Americas connecting with African ancestors before the transatlantic slave trade. And so not having one's experience of ancestry be defined only by a period of intense hardship. And for people of European ancestry, that can include connecting with ancestors before the ones who are enacting colonialism and white supremacy in the form of slavery and other things like that. And so connecting with older ancestors helps our sense of cultural self to become more evened out or regular sized. And I say that because what's so pervasively sticky and hard to dismantle at times about racism is this oversimplified idea that there are different races. Like, it's a very new invention to really think of it in that way. There are ideas that have been circulating for a while from the Greeks, but they didn't really get legally and so drastically institutionalized in the Americas until the late 1600s. And so the breaking up of that really monolithic idea of white people, black people, and I suppose yellow people and red people that occurs inherently in the ancestor work when people are like, oh, these are early Germanic ancestors, or these people are from Mali or from the Congo or from Indonesia or from very specific parts of the world. And so that is helpful to break up monolithic ideas of race. And there's also an opportunity to break out of just, I guess I was speaking to before, victim-victimizer mindset, to see the full spectrum of power dynamics within our different lineages. That's healthy for our sense of self, and it's there's something about reclaiming our humanity, to not just be in one way of seeing ourselves, and to see that there are very specific, precious, ancient, magical gifts that we inherit from our people, and to love who we are in a specific way. The white people I work with tend to have low cultural self-esteem. I mean, obviously toxic, like white supremacy or inflated white people are so cool, like overt racism. Typically, I mean, I'm well aware it exists, but I don't tend to encounter that view as much in my circles. It's more the repentant white guilt, white people are so terrible view, which is still white centering. It's still, the low self-esteem is still not yet regular sized. And so ancestor work helps people to become regular sized, at which point you can actually relate with other regular sized humans without getting into this ancestral inflation. I'm bigger than you, I'm smaller than you. Because of all the different cultural troubles, racism is especially rooted around the topic of ancestry. The same people of my specific ancestry are better or worse than people of your ancestry. So it's ancestral favoritism, essentially, that becomes institutionalized and, toxic. Yeah. And one final thing about how the work can be helpful is relating with our ancestors is a source of resilience. And they're a resource that can help us to stay, connected to life purpose, able to metabolize the kinds of troubles that are just part of the culture we are in. And so they're a source of healthy pride, healthy self-esteem, which is good medicine when the culture is so off the mark. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so fascinating to me how you articulated that the racism as ancestral separate or favoritism, because there's that tricky thing with racism, how insidious it is that, like, while yes, it's ancestral favoritism, it's also in a sense this erasure from your ancestors, from your people, from your unique cultures and customs and foods and languages. I think those are both present.
Yeah, well, it certainly is with whiteness.
Yeah.
I mean, it's super understandable for people to have things like Asian pride, Native pride, Black pride. Mm-hmm. White pride, it just doesn't have the same ring. And it's like, and so there's nothing for me as someone who's just ancestrally like a white person. I find that it's important to claim that when needed and be like, sure, yeah, of course. And also, it's not an identity I'm interested in polishing up or recovering. It's an amnesiac identity. It's a forgetting. It's a trade-in of specific regional beautiful cultures of Europe, and for a messed up system of white supremacy and privileges and inequality in the Americas. And so now I'm not saying that others therefore should relate the same, like if African American people want to celebrate Black Pride, of course, and I would suggest to anyone who cares to hear what I have to say about it, that there is additionally a benefit to seeing how the beauty of Senegalese or Wolof culture is different from Dagara culture, is different from Igbo culture, and to make sure that the use of this generalized umbrella of Blackness doesn't diminish in any way the tremendous diversity and the differently beautiful cultures of continental Africa, and including in the diaspora. So I'm a fan of trying to be as specific as possible, because I think that celebration of ancestral diversity breaks up the monolithic and problematic idea of different races. And so it's just a loser of an idea that there are inherently different races. And so so what's the antidote to racism, like conceptually? It's not anti-racism. That you can't replace something with nothing, magically speaking. So what's the affirmation? If I try to affirm what the affirmation is, equality isn't even very compelling, because it implies sameness. And we're pattern recognizing people. Like, we can't pretend that we don't notice difference. That's fighting our deep structural nature. And so for me, it's something like proactive celebration of ancestral difference. To recognize, see, and appreciate, and just celebrate the differences in the diversity. Yeah.
Beautiful. So over the past 15 years, you've guided about a few thousand people through this work. So can you reflect on some of what you've noticed about similarities and differences in how European ancestor folks, especially those who have a settler or colonizer ancestry, and maybe people of color, experience this work differently?
Yeah. That's a big question. For people of European ancestry, which are, when I think of settler, colonizer, and folks, and for people who aren't familiar with that technical language, it's people whose ancestors participated in colonizing different areas and then also occupied those areas. And that's a harmful behavior that white people don't have a monopoly on. I mean, Chinese are settler colonizers in Tibet, and the Aztec were settler colonizers in Purepecha land. So it happens in different periods of human history, but especially in Australia, South Africa, the Americas, a lot of European colonizers were also settlers and ongoing occupiers of traditional land. So that's certainly the case for my own ancestry. And one of the things that can come from that is that there's a sense of ancestral belonging or ability to be understood, because a lot of white people I meet have a genuine longing for earth-connected spirituality and community. That is not inherently a problem, but it can show up as a neediness or a grabbiness toward more intact earth-honoring systems, which are often maintained by people of color. And so if this ghosty, hungry, needy white person energy comes to those communities and teachers and systems, it can be really off-putting and really awkward, and at worst kind of like, I'm bad, can you redeem me, person of color? And I think people of color, it's just like, dude, you're being weird, go handle yourself somehow, which is great advice, actually. And so partly that looks like seeing that earth-honoring cultures of Europe those ancestral spirits are available in the present. And to connect with them in the present is a trigger also to feel the sorrow and the grief for the intense genocidal behavior within Europe, the profound white-on-white crime that led to the trauma in white-bodied people that was then exported all over the world and transferred to other kinds of bodies. One, Russ Mamanekin's book, My Grandmother's Hands, is very articulate on that specific dynamic. And so in that way, it's satisfying for me to help white people to see the origins of their own ancestral trauma. And there's a possibility that there could be healing and grieving from that, and then enough self-esteem to participate in a less awkward way in good allyship and healing with people of color. And, I'm always wary to, even in a general way, try to speak for the experiences of people of color. But if I try to notice what or they're patterns I've observed in stepping people through the work. For one, the historical dislocation from ancestor honoring cultures is more recent than it is for white people typically. So even someone whose ancestors in the Americas were forcibly brought, let's say in the 1600s, that's still only 400 years ago that their people were practicing ancestor honoring traditions, assuming they didn't continue in the Americas. And for most European ancestor people, it's been 1,000, 1,500 years. And so and for many Native North American people, it's, it might be a generation or two, or maybe even 200 years, but almost certainly not longer than that, since their people, when they were alive on Earth, were actively ritually honoring the ancestors. And so the fact that the disconnect is more historically recent often means that there's actually more rawness and pain and sorrow that's present. It's like, I'm seeing the difference between a fire. Like if you have a big fire and you just, kick the logs over and there's fire everywhere, it's kind of burning and it's like a flagrant, but still quite alive mess. That's different than just pouring water on the fire and letting it sit for 1,000 years. So to generalize, a lot of white people's ancestor work looks like having to just get the fire going again. And so it's less raw up front. Once white people get to curl up in a ball, snotting and grieving about what's been lost, I'm like, yeah, good. Now we're talking. So there's that. And I'll say that I'm really encouraged by the other than European ancestor folks who are starting to guide this work for others, because it's been a real desire for me to have queer people, women, people of color, indigenous folks, be able to work with a practitioner who's not a white guy from Ohio. I mean, I'll do my best, but I respect that people want someone of their respective background. That's a legit request. So I'm glad for others starting to carry the work in that way. Yeah. One other thing. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I know, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that the way that I approach ancestor work, the main thing that I'm teaching in a public-facing way is ritual repair work. And it assumes that there's cultural damage. And so that if someone engages in the work that the lineage healing work that I've developed, where you arrive at is like zero. You come out of ancestral deficit and into becoming a regular sized person who's in relationship with your well ancestors. At that point, a lot of traditional indigenous systems make sense for you to participate in. But until that point, you're carrying ancestral wounding and deficit that traditional indigenous systems may or may not have ritual technologies to thoroughly address, because they haven't tended to historically, there wasn't a situation of 1,000 years of failing to take care of the ancestors. So it's not like an easy ritual for that. And so there's I don't mean it as a plug for my work, but what I'm saying is that it's important to recognize that there's a need for repair when people come to the topic of ancestry. And some traditional systems don't recognize that because they historically didn't need it in the same way. There was an individual repair needed, but not a whole systemic breakdown of ancestor reverence. So.
Yeah, that's certainly been my experience in my own very diverse ancestral lines, that in the indigenous traditions I've gone to, there's been so much nourishing medicine as I've explored the traditions and studied with teachers in them. But to address these larger, 1,000-year-old ancestral problems, I really needed techniques that I was receiving from contemporary practitioners that were doing this work like yourself, that we're really looking at what are the unique needs of people in this time that are experiencing this specific problem to these contemporary Western people. And so, I've been really grateful for people like yourself doing that work and figuring out ways that we can actually solve these seemingly impossible problems of these deep divides and gaps in our lineages.
Yeah, good. I'll say another way that I didn't think to name earlier that work with the ancestors can help with cultural healing is we have a tremendous backlog of grief that we're sitting on. And the good thing about the contemporary news and internet media is that we can bring more awareness to the troubles that have kind of been happening all along, or at least in the recent centuries. But the downside is it's very easy to get flooded with our nervous systems and really despairing and discouraging, just discouraged and despairing. And the more spiritual backing and resilience we have, the deeper we can go into grief and really feel the sorrow of what we're in. And if we can't find our way into that, our life will get a little flattened. We won't have quite as much joy either. And so the grief is the price of entry to greater relatedness and intimacy. Mm-hmm. And that's true with the ancestors. And just, if you want to be a whole human being, you can't separate yourself from the pain of other people completely. It's good to be able to feel it. But if you are only flooded by it, then it's not helpful. The ancestors can help with the regulation. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly in my life I've experienced that when we don't have the ritual container, or we're not right with our people enough to really be safe in feeling and experiencing and releasing that grief, it does become a sort of poison in our heart, in a sense that cuts off intimacy in all of our relationships in our life in different ways.
Yeah.
So speaking of separation, we've been talking a lot about the differences between European ancestor folks and people of color, but I'm especially maybe biased, curious about your experience with multiracial people with a blend of, historically oppressed and oppressor ancestries. I'm curious, in your work with clients and perhaps even in your own process, how you've experienced that kind of ancestral recovery work for those folks.
Yeah, it's good. It's not strongly part of my own direct lived experience. And I mean, if I dig deep, I could say there's tensions between England and Ireland and things like that. But realistically, I come from a pretty homogenous ancestral region in some ways, at least from a distance. But in my work with others and the way I've seen it, for one, multiracial people have a tremendously important voice and role and particular kind of lived experience and medicine to bring to the times, insofar as there's a really strong tendency for people's thinking and approach to cultural change even to get really rigid, black and white, very, this category, that category. Everybody who's of this background line up over here, everybody's of that background line up over here, and let's have a Facebook war. And there's an erasure or a making invisible of the experiences of multiracial people in that type of interaction. And that's problematic. And so another way in which multiracial people have it's a kind of burden that, if worked with, becomes a strong blessing, as I see it, to harmonize different lineages in your own heart and to not discard or devalue anything about who you are requires a kind of, peacemaking or ancestral diplomacy within the space of your own body. And my approach to the work, one thing that people have asked, why is it so focused on blood or blood lineage? And I have a lot of respect for other than blood ancestors, but I am biased that it's important to work with ancestors of blood because of the way in which we're working with this very body and not running from the body level experience, so that we also include body experience. And does that mean that there are ancestors in our blood who are there have been conceptions that are non-consensual? Of course, yes. Which is not limited to people of different ancestral backgrounds, but it includes that. And so sometimes to claim the different ancestries that we're a part of does that suggest that it's possible, if people choose to claim the ancestors of someone who raped another one of their ancestors? I am suggesting that's possible. It's not my place to say people should do that. But what I have found is that if people choose to engage in that type of cultural, recovery or ancestral inclusivity, the older ancestors of the ones who committed that harm are almost certainly happy to hold their typically grandson to account and to help the one who committed those harms to transform, to have healing, and in that way to be able to make reparations and to address what has happened. And so the dead change, the dead can heal, and they can become allies in our work in the present. And anyone's ancestors who behaved harmfully during life can become essentially like anti-racist allies working for the greater good now. Many of them are actually quite ready to do that. And so there's a thread in here about forgiveness and reconciliation that can happen in the body. And so that's a little bit about it. Yeah, I'd be interested if you'd like to share, Langston, about anything from your own lived experience that you might want to add for listeners. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in my own ancestry, my on my father's side, I'm German Jewish and Swiss, and on my mother's side, there's various origins of African ancestry. From genealogical research and genetic testing, you found a lot of it is Nigerian and Malian, but some of it is also Scottish on that side of my ancestors, partly because of like an overseer who raped one of my ancestors. So I've had to, grapple with that and dive into a bit and wrestle with that part of my lineage and see how much I did want to engage with that part of my lineage. What was surprising to me, actually, as I started to move deeper into the healing of my ancestral lines, was that I found there's a part of me that was a little bit more distrustful of my ancestors who might be seen as white, like my Swiss ancestors. And there was ways in which I was holding this distrust in my body from experiences that I'd had in my life. And the ancestor, and it wasn't just me distrusting them, it was also not distrusting that I would be accepted by them or really seen as their grandchild in a sense. And so a lot of my work with them was them sort of laughing at me and saying like, what are you talking about? You're really confirming me as their child in that way and helping me to see where I was just holding on to this stuff that I had been indoctrinated into by my culture. Like you're talking about these sort of illusions of race in a sense. And so that's just been an interesting process moving through all of that. I think also as a person of color, when I think of like reconnecting with my ancestors, the first place I want to go is to my ancestors of various African lineages, because there's this sense that there is living whole culture there. Whereas the illusion of whiteness almost makes one feel like there isn't something to reclaim or claim on those other sides, which isn't the case, isn't true, of course. But I think that was something I also needed to work through, even though ironically for me, the first ancestor who stepped forward actually in a mediumship session for me really strongly was in the Swiss ancestors, my dad's mother. And she came through very strongly, and within a week of that experience of meeting her in that way, my parents found this letter that she had written me for when Langston writes his book that detailed 7 generations of my ancestors and their names, and I had none of that information. So that was actually like how I began in ancestor work, just having that very direct experience. But even with that direct connection and communication, I still had a lot of work to do to sort of take out of my body this internalized racism, which went both ways. Not to say that I was racist toward my white ancestors, that's not possible, but that because of my experience with racism in my life, there was a distrust there and more of a difficulty with connecting that I had to work through.
No, that's great. I have another question for you, if you don't mind, just to follow up. A curiosity is, have you, in really claiming and owning and welcoming different uh, ancestral identities, plural, from different parts of the world, have you found that your sense of cultural self is like inherently plural, that there's like a council rather than I'm this, like it's we, like there's a for me, I'm interested in general and ways of constructing identity that don't reinforce just one singular Daniel, one singular Langston. And I'm interested if you notice when you're relating with others who come from maybe a more uh, just one part of the world background ancestrally, that for you there's the sense of holding multiple realities kind of all the time, that your baseline is multiple. It's we, or there's a team, or there's a you follow me with it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think on one sense, yes. And that's been for a long time, I think, but especially the more I engage in my ancestral line, the more there's this multiplicity of perspectives that are wanting to come through me. And I think the more you engage in that work, at least for me, the more I've engaged in that work, the more those voices harmonize and become more coherent.
Mm-hmm.
And more just like a stream that's moving through you. So it's less of a sense of like a lot of disparate voices kind of wrestling with each other, which maybe was more of my experience before to
Mm-hmm.
some extent. With that said, I think when you talk about identity, for me, I identify as a Black queer man. And that's not that I am, fixated on those identities. I don't think it's healthy to be too fixated on any identity. But for me, it was a more plural identity to identify as Black than when I identified as biracial. Because there is a way that the word, the term, the culture around identifying as biracial, even though it helps to sort of move past a little bit that sort of one drop rule that we have, there's an erasure there to some extent, and an erasure of the experience of being perceived as Black in this country. Because when I was growing up, I grew up in New York until I was about 6, in this really great, diverse school with so many different kinds of friends. And then I was thrust into upper middle class white suburbia. And it was a very different experience. I was like the one Black kid in my school. And I didn't really have a context for race at that time. And so I just internalized that as, oh, I'm just weird, so people don't like me, or people are violent towards me, or people are gonna like think there's things living in my hair, or like they ask me why I curl my hair. That's just because I'm weird, something wrong with me. And so in really claiming and honoring my Black identity, that allowed me to begin to parse out what was mine and what was my culture's, in a sense, and begin to create connection with different parts of my identity in that way.
Great. No, that's good. Yeah, thank you for sharing from your experience. Yeah, great.
So I guess we didn't talk too much about your experience as a practitioner in Ifa Orisha tradition. And I mean, I feel like you already spoke about before how that was part of a turning point in your consciousness around prioritizing racism as a area of healing in your life. And so I'm just curious how that informed your understanding. If you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, so I'm an initiate of Ifa and Obatala, Oshun, and Oshugbo Society, and Egungun Society, the several deities, and also Ancestral Medium Society, and in the lineage of Oluwafalalu, the Sanya Boyade of Oderemo, and so southwestern Nigeria, Ogun State. And I was thinking when you were speaking about the unity and multiplicity and your sense of self of the Egungun, the ancestral masquerades, and how initiates in the ancestor, Egungun means the collective spirit of the ancestors, and Egungun means the bones in Yoruba language. And so the sense is that when one is in a mediumship state, there's a colorful cloth that a person's covered in from head to toe, so you can't see their individuality, but the cloth is decorated with many different colored fabrics, and so there's a very clear communication of unity and diversity at the same time. And even the voice that one speaks from when in that state is an altered voice. It's like a low, gravelly voice. So the individuality is obscured, and it's the voice of the ancestors. So just thinking of that from your share a moment ago. But, and in my initiation to Egungun, it was one of the moments where I wasn't aware of my whiteness in West Africa. And because Nigeria is an all-black society, like with very few exceptions. It's not like South Africa. It doesn't have the same settler-colonizer situation, just regular colonialism from the British. And so you stand out as a white person when you're there. And it's fine. It comes with certain, experiences, but but when you're in masquerade, when one is in masquerade, there's an erasure of individuality. And so that was very, I hadn't expected that experience. And what to say? I felt very nourished and humbled by being welcomed in to a family of traditionalists who were very generous with their culture, provided people come with humility. The settings of traditional cultures vary so widely, from quite open to totally closed. Yoruba culture tends to be quite open to people who would come with humility, partly because Yoruba people, generalizing here, have a great sense of cultural self-esteem. They're like, our culture is fantastic. Why wouldn't everyone in the world want it? Like, obviously, you have good sense. You're coming here to learn from us. And so seeing that kind of healthy self-esteem modeled is really beautiful. And it's my own ancestors of blood, my own European ancestors are like, yeah, you should do that. You should take the step and get involved with those traditions even more. It'll be good for you to make you a better ritualist. You'll understand us better. And so my own ancestors are pragmatic, and they understand that our European traditions are quite fragmented, and that there's beauty and benefit to stepping into an intact lineage of practice. So that's been good. And, my last trip to Nigeria, I just went by myself, last year. And before our daughter arrived, I wanted to get in one last trip for a minute. And there were moments where I was just hanging out with the guys, and they were doing work for a local client, and just praying with them. And they'd offer a prayer, Fabole, it's my Yoruba name. And so I would in Yoruba, and it was sweet. Like, it's taken a while to actually find a groove with things and to feel like I'm, getting my bearings with Yoruba culture. But to just be able to hang out and be welcomed into the family and to enjoy that intimacy is really precious. It gives me a hopeful feeling and some reference point for how earth honoring culture and community can happen. So that's been really beautiful. And there's not a lot of ancestral damage there. So I've had to explain this work to my Yoruba teacher, Oluwafalalu, and he has to really slow down and try to be like, okay, oh, sorry, Baba. Like, sounds like you guys have some problems. I'm like, we do. We have a lot of ancestral trouble. He's like, oh, sorry. Okay, good. Like he kind of conceptually gets it, but it's not a kind of trouble they have there. So that's actually really nice to see. Yeah. It's like I worked as a counselor, if you're working with abused children all day, and then suddenly you get around healthy, well-adjusted children, it's like, oh, that's so good. What a relief. So, yeah. So those are a few things. There's a lot I could say about that, but it's been humbling and healing and beneficial to be welcomed in. Yeah.
And do you feel like, as you're continuing in this work, there's any growth edges that are coming up for you right now around the intersections of ancestral recovery and healing of racism?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of it is just staying in the conversation. And it's so easy to want to jump out of the uncomfortable. Just all the mess of fresh pain and fresh harm and trauma around racism that's happening in the United States and beyond. But, of course, I'm here mostly. And feel good about using my position to try to bring awareness to race and racism as much as possible. And what I'm excited about is trusting in the wisdom of the people who are not me and have more ancestrally diverse backgrounds to carry the work I've developed in a way that they really bring their own style and adaptation and wisdom to it, and discovering things that I, because of my own cultural position, wouldn't see or wouldn't consider, and helping the work to be more effective in meeting people of different backgrounds. So I'm excited for that. And there's a bit of trust and breathing to allow others to make changes, make improvements, adapt it. So that's exciting. And I've learned, and I'm continuing to learn, to just not respond with defensiveness. You know, I'm operating to even speak about healing with racism as a white person is I don't even mean to complain about it. It's like, get out the small violin. Come on, really, Daniel? Are you going to complain about that? But it can be contentious at times, and it's messy. And sometimes I'll say things that are not quite on the mark, or even if I'm communicating clearly, maybe somebody just comes with anger or hostility. And so I've learned to just be more steady and patient and non-defensive in moments like that. And that's just like, if I want to actually speak on things rather than just avoid speaking on it like so many people do, then there's just a need to hang with the discomfort and the contentiousness that can arise at times, mostly on social media, because it enables that type of interaction, but occasionally in person as well. And that's fine. That's just part of choosing to be a participant rather than a bystander. Yeah.
I think some of that patience and willingness to be vulnerable in that way and not defensive, that I appreciate about the way you offer your work in the world. It seems like a testament to the work itself. Like, certainly in my own experience, the more that I root into my well ones, the more I feel I have that capacity to stay open in moments of conflict and still feel held and not uprooted from the earth. And,
yeah. Now, I'll say one last thing. I think is something I'm excited about is the development of ritual technologies to be used, especially by people whose ancestors are well in spirit, to give voice to the conversations that we're already unconsciously in anyways. So in this moment, there's a conversation between me and all my ancestors and you and all your ancestors. And that's true with everybody all the time. But we don't often hold that awareness, or if we do, we misuse it, or we don't hold it skillfully. And so how do we take a ritual container, fundamentals of like good therapy, trauma regulation, and goodwill, and convert that into ritual forms that allow us to have those conversations between each other's sets of ancestors in a way that lead to healing outcomes? That's charged, it's exciting, and we might as well try to do it consciously because it's happening unconsciously anyways. So, yeah, good. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really interesting to hear about this aspect of your work, and I'm really appreciative of your sharing all this with us today.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Langston. And I hope people feel encouraged also to check out your offerings and work at occupyyourheart.com.
Yeah, occupy-your-heart.com.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Daniel.